Hey everyone, welcome to Beyond. Be sure to hit like and subscribe so the algorithm can find this show. And today, the man needs no introduction. We have Burke Brown. Burke, welcome.
What's up, Ben? Glad to be doing it again, man. We're handling this. Beautiful.
Yeah. Well, I think we have some great topics, and in this day and age, with the uncertainty, some of these topics are very timely. And today, I really want to talk about 6 reasons why people ignore you and how you can stand out. And I think it's a big issue. If you go into a company or you're going into a group of people, whether it be at a college, you're a new freshman or wherever you may find yourself, we've all had times in life where we go into a situation and we feel utterly ignored. We're not part of that clique. We don't fit in, and we're not sure why. And I remember reading a quote from Viktor Frankl that says, when we can no longer change the situation, we are challenged to change ourselves. So certainly, as we would attest, there's no worse feeling in life than being ignored from that person we're pursuing or that job we want. And we get in that dynamic and they have this pressure, the political pressure of organizations where you just don't feel the intrinsic fit. So the first reason I believe we're ignored is your presence is not memorable. First impressions are critical. We know that when we meet people, I've read in the first 6 seconds, people sort of judge who you are based on what you say, based on how you look, right? And we know there's no greater impact on your career or personal relationships than that first impression. In fact, I read, Burke, where we know that nonverbal communication can make up 85% of communication. So what we say, our intonation, our tone of our voice, it is drowned out by the nonverbal, how we come across, how we sort of handle ourselves. So in your experience and research, what are some strategies we can implement to make a greater impact on the people we meet?
Right. It's interesting because really, when we want to make a first impression, the reason we want to make a first impression is so that it's easier to make the second, third, fourth, fifth impression. You want to just have a great introduction and then move on from there. I think one of the most important things is this is not even research-based. This is the stuff that our parents told us all the time, the eye contact, right? A firm handshake. There are very specific things that a lot of people don't engage in. When I'm introducing myself to people and I'm meeting them, there's sometimes when I'm like, okay, it's a limp handshake. My question is like, why is the handshake so light? Why are your eyes shifting back and forth? Unconsciously, as a human, when we see this, we're like, are you not certain of your worthiness to be here? And ultimately, that is what it comes down to. If you don't believe that you are worthy, and that means if you are worrying about if you are worthy or not, you don't believe that you're worthy, then you're in a position where you are constantly on the defense. You are constantly trying to prove that you are something as opposed to being it. And so ultimately, this always comes back to believing and having confidence in yourself. When you trust yourself, you will have the firm handshake. When you trust yourself, you will look directly into the eyes of the person. When you trust yourself, your words will flow out and you will use your hands. Because why? You know that you have the ability to communicate, and all your job is to connect with the person so you can get that information to transfer over. So a lot of it really comes down to confidence. And there is so much research about that the way that you stand, the way that you hold yourself will shift the way that you show up. They did some crazy research, man, where they had these individuals who would stand in 2 different postures. One would be a posture of weakness, and the other was a posture of power. So posture of power would be your shoulders are back, your hands are behind your head, you're kind of taking up space versus kind of being contrite and small. What they found that within the people, those who were in this small contrite space had more cortisol, more nervousness, more anxiety. It was harder for them to take risks. They're more risk averse. While people who were in this open posture space were able to be more risk takers because they faked it till they made it. They believed that they were able to be worthy of being in that space. So now the research itself is not like 100% on point, but the idea that it translates is really important. The way that you see yourself, your self-concept will determine how people see you.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I also reflect on experiences in my life, and I've seen it done to other people, that you can get to points in life where you get this epic confidence. Like you think of Navy SEALs and what they're able to do. Training's all about developing competence and confidence, right?
Right.
And then you come across people in your career at some points where they're Machiavellian and they're trying to control the frame, right? And of course, it's the old steeple, right? They sit back like this and they're really trying to project
Right,
power,
right.
and they do have the power because they have a position,
Right.
right? And it's almost like counterintuitive. You think when you're leading people, you want to encourage, motivate, train, educate, lift up the next generation. But ultimately, we come across these really Machiavellian personalities where they want to destroy the confidence. So what are some things we could do as we're thinking about building confidence? How aware should we be of these different kind of personalities that are coming in, trying to
Right.
undercut what we're trying to become.
Man, Lao Tzu in the Tao Te Ching, it says something really powerful. One of my favorite actually verses from there. It says, "Why is the sea king of 1,000 streams? Because it lies beneath them. If the sage is to lead his people, he must serve from behind. Because he does not compete, he does not meet competition." And this kind of an extraction of really the essence of what it is. But ultimately, what it means is that if I am to be a true leader, if I'm to truly stand out, it is not for me to be at the top of the mountain, because the top of the mountain actually gets the least amount of water. I have to be the sea where all the streams pour into, right? It's this level of humility. A true leader is able to be humble because it doesn't have to prove anything. One of my favorite quotes that I always tell everybody is, the man who has nothing to prove proves everything already. If I'm trying to prove that I'm strong, powerful, great, if I'm trying to prove that, then it shows, like I said before, that you do not have it. You do not believe it. Because as soon as I get into proving mechanism, I'm saying that you are the judge whether I am or am not. And only until I flex and exert my power do I feel strong. But a true person who knows that they are a leader serves. And it's the ability to be underneath them. Jack Welch does a great job of explaining that the job of a manager is to make them not need that job anymore. It's either that they promote up or they can get a job better somewhere else because they've gained the skill sets they need to be better human beings, to be better managers. And that's really what we're all supposed to do. A true person that's memorable doesn't withhold information so they can grow. They give it away. They support. They build. I want you to look better because secretly that makes me look better, as opposed to I want to look better, so secretly I have to stop you from looking better. Two different mindsets. One is archaic and old. One is from the hindbrain. The other is more from the frontal cortex. It's understanding community. And that's really what the difference is. To truly be a leader, you must be a servant. To truly be remembered, you have to be willing to not be achieving the spotlight all the time, because that's where people who, once they achieve the spotlight, look back to you and say, if it wasn't for you, I wouldn't have got here.
Exactly right. You know, it seems to me, it goes back to what we said last week about the Peter Principle. Sometimes people are promoted to the level of incompetence and they're trying to lead. They don't have the tools. And so they lead through exertion of force, right? I was
Right.
watching this thing called Tank Man, which is the Tiananmen Square fiasco in '89.
Right.
And this lone Chinese man came up to a stack of tanks, a row of tanks that were one behind another. And he literally got in front of this tank and just stopped it. And
Yeah.
as the tank tried to pivot and move, he just would follow the tank's movements and stopped it. And that was sort of a sort of an iconic moment for the ages, if you will, where you had this brutally repressive regime, and one person stood up, maybe didn't have the skill sets, but he was making a statement. So I think a lot of times we come into situations where we're promoted in business and we don't have the skills. And
Right.
sometimes, though, even those people that don't have the skills have an innate sense about what leadership is, right? How to lead people from the heart, from a leadership perspective, meaning servant, as you're talking about. And so I think a lot of times these people come into situations fully unequipped to do what they're doing, and it really is devastating the organization, the whole politics, you know, prize, power, position,
Right.
force of will. They've come from other perhaps cultures in business that are not conducive to what you're talking about. So I think it's really, really important. And by the way, I would say we're talking about ignoring people. Not only do we get ignored, but I would argue that those bosses ultimately get ignored. They're not effective. People just tune them out. It's sort of like that dog that just keeps barking. After a while, their ability to influence gets radically diminished.
And the productivity is what is a perfect definition of it. If that manager comes up because they've done so well at sales, they're like, okay, well, now you can be a sales manager. They're sometimes all they know is sales. So they want to make sure that they get the sales, right? And so they don't know how to spread that wealth into the team. And what happens is productivity lags and it'll be exposed. Truly, if you are a leader, you must be able to focus on those that you're leading. If you're focusing on being the leader, if the title of leadership is too strong, then it's a problem. And that's something I remember when back in the day, what I used to say is when I was at a certain church, I was just like, don't call it leadership, call it servanthood. Because just the psychology of calling it servitude, calling it something that is more of this underneath helping up, it helps because unconsciously, all of us want to be a leader. All of us want to be an entrepreneur. Go to San Francisco, I can throw a rock and hit one. So all the thing is that when you realize that the goal is to be at a space that's beneath, as opposed to just be good at your one thing and think that's what's going to get you to climb the ladder, it's that shift in mindset that really makes the difference.
Boy, that's so true. And you know, languages of power. We were talking about this a couple of weeks ago. I was listening to Morgan Freeman talk about. This was a conversation with Mike Wallace, 60 Minutes, when he was alive, and Mike was talking about Black History Month, and Morgan kind of looked at him quizzically, and And Mike, well, I mean, Morgan was, and Mike Wallace was like, well, isn't that important? He goes, well, do you have a White History Month? And Mike's like, no. He goes, well, and Mike goes, well, I'm Jewish. He goes, well, you have a Jewish History Month. He goes, no. Why do we want a Black History Month? Why isn't it American History Month, right? And then Mike says, well, what about racism? He goes, what about it? He goes, don't think about it. So the idea and the power in a word, leadership, right, or servanthood, or racist, or whatever we want to label things, there's tremendous power in those words, and certainly as leaders, and it's certainly sometimes as people come across needy, we need to be thinking about the words we tell ourselves and the words we allow into our cranium, right, from other people. So,
Right.
so very powerful.
It's interesting too. Yeah. Because I think that, and this is a very true statement. This is something that's really important to me too, is when Morgan Freeman's saying that, he's ultimately saying what the highest goal is that we want to get to is where we just see each other as men. I'm a man, right? It's not just this color coding, but what we have to do is we understand that that rhetoric exists now, right? There's the black, there's the white, there's these rhetorics that were created from nothing, right? And they exist. And so what we do is we have to make sure, if you almost look at Jesus Christ, the way that he spoke was he was able to speak in a language that was not reality, but it was the reality of the people that were around him. He says the kingdom of God is like such and such, but let's tone it down. The kingdom of God is like a farmer in his land. And so what he does is he speaks to the people in the language that they know. And what I love about Morgan Freeman when he's saying that is he's saying ultimately we want to get to a space where there's black culture and there's different cultures. I understand that. But ultimately we want to get to a space where we are just seen as ourselves, right? We can honor the cultures, but at this point as we live, we have to speak in the language of the rhetoric that was created. But once we understand to speak and love each other within that rhetoric, we move to a new rhetoric of humanity, the human race. That's the space that we want to get to. But we can't jump to that and still understand all the systemic issues that are existing. But we have to come and understand that, okay, we have to use the rhetoric that exists and then move. And so in the same way, when you're talking with leadership, when I'm talking to leaders, I can't just go into a business and organization and say, okay, we're going to change it to servitude. They're not going to have the mindset to do that. So what I do is I speak in the language of leadership and I redefine what leadership is. And then once we understand that it's a different leadership, then all of a sudden we can move it from this kind of cog machine to a kind of what I say is, instead of an organization, ultimately what it is an organism. An organism naturally works to keep all of the system alive. An organization is more separate. And so when people get fired or let go, there's no pain at the top level. But if we can turn it into an organism, then we understand that to amputate a piece of it is painful. And if there's any way that we can heal it without losing people or firing people just to make sure we're making more money, then what we're doing is we're empowering people. So I speak in the language that exists, organization, leadership, management, but my goal is to slowly transmute that till we become post to a place of it's an organism, it's a community. Ultimately, a business is a family. When you have that mindset, you're not just thinking profits over people. You're thinking about the entire holistic goodness, and that's where power exists. But we start in the language that everybody knows. We'll speak as farmers, and we'll move our way up.
Yeah, that's good. It reminds me of when they're sort of including this conversation. Morgan looks at Mike and says, you know, as opposed to Morgan, the black man, and Mike, the white guy, why can't it just be Morgan and Mike, right? Just right. Our names of what we are. I think that's very powerful. So I think the second reason out of the 6 why people ignore us and be ignored is because they come across as being too needy. And we've all seen that in relationships at some level, whether you're a boss or in a relationship or with friendships, there's this needy dynamic goes on. And we know that if you're a needy person, it's like a 100-pound weight every time you get around that friend, right? Over time, this will just suffocate relationships. And people want to be there to help, for sure. I think there's a lot of people, when you come across with a struggle or a challenge or something you're trying to figure out, people by nature really, really want to help. But if the main approach is dependence and becoming a burden, I think people just sort of push away. So in your experience, in your studies, what in your estimate causes people to become needy?
You know, the word is codependency, and codependency is something that it's highly prevalent in all of us. I think our world has taught us to be codependent. What codependent means is ultimately it's this belief that my existence is in a very heavy way related to the actions or movements or non-movements of another person. Codependency means my emotion, my world perspective, everything changes based on what other people or other situations are happening around me. When you're in that place, then you are a codependent. And what that means is I'm dependent on it. It's not independent, where I'm independent only on my own ideologies, my own perspectives, my own experiences. Though something happens outside, I can separate myself from it. But when you're in a codependent space, what happens is you need validation. Validation comes from an external source. When you have to have an external source tell you that you are something, then you are forever a slave to that thing. And the problem is that if you become that way for a person who's not prepared, who's receiving it, if I have a person that's needy, unconsciously, I can enjoy that. And when I enjoy that, I will unconsciously take advantage of it. And I will start to begin to work in a way where I can control the person because I can't control my life. So it's easier for me to control this person. And what ends up happening is that person becomes codependent themselves. And so it's this symbiotic relationship of people that are feeding off each other in their own weaknesses to keep things moving. If it's drama they want, they'll find the drama. They'll create it out of nothing. But the goal is to be able to separate. And just as if you were to pull away from drinking alcohol or coffee for so long, withdrawals. You pull away from a drug, you're going to have withdrawals. The ability for the person to step away and not need the other person's response or reaction or the world or anything to do what it's supposed to do for you to be okay, that's where you gain that independence. But it's very, very difficult for us because if we look at it, all of us are very codependent. We're codependent with our phones, right? If it's good news coming out of this thing, we're good. If it's bad news, we're bad. It's this ability to say that my peace, my joy, and my anger is outside of my control. And it's a very dangerous place to be, especially in the workplace. Because if you can't be independent and have thoughts that are separate from your management, if you can't step out and be more of a risk taker, then you do not have the creative aptitude to be able to become a manager. You won't be seen if you're just following the cogs. So codependency is also conformity. And in a real big way, the only way to kind of grow as a human being is to break outside of the status quo, which means you have to take risk. Elon Musk, a perfect example of that. PayPal, he did it. It was done. You've succeeded. You have all the validation. But then he's putting himself into businesses that are almost guaranteed to fail, willing to take the risk. He wasn't dependent upon where his money needed to be and put it in a business that'll guarantee income. He put it on his dream. He was an independent exister. And then from there, it became interdependent as he pulled together this incredible team to do what he's doing now. But ultimately, it's that ability to break free from neediness and be willing to take risks, make mistakes, fail, engage, learn, reset, regrow, and then add that new knowledge to do something amazing.
You know, being needy is really important to a lot of organizations, right? I mean, they are built on the need factor of people. I can think of, you know, occults or religions at some level. We know people sometimes come into religion where they're not at their strongest state, right? And so that there's some manipulation going on at some level. So what are some practical things that people can do to become less needy? I mean, what is it they can do to say, I'm aware of it,
right?
I'm going to take some steps to start to peel away from that sort of that dynamic and that approach.
Right. I'll start at a very minute level because I think it's something that people can relate to. When you're at work, you're at a job, and you don't know the answer to something, you don't want to immediately ask for help. I remember a while back, I was working at a mortgage company when I first started, and I asked a question to my manager, and he's like, "Did you search it?" I'm like, "Yeah, I kind of did." He goes, "No, did you look it up before you got to me?" And I'm like, "Well, I think that I looked up this." He goes, "How hard did you look?" And he goes, "For me to come and help you with this is something that you can do yourself." And I'm just sitting there, I'm like, and this boss manager was my friend. And I'm just sitting there, and I'm like, whoa, okay. Literally from that point on, I would never ask for any type of help or question because I knew for a fact that if I didn't do everything I could in my power to figure it out, then I had no right to talk to a manager. So I think one of the smallest things to do is if you find yourself asking too many questions, try to find the answers yourself. Do as much as you can. If you don't know exactly how to craft an email or find a way to learn it. Ask your coworker, search online, do as much work as you possibly can do in-house. Because as you build that, what you're doing is creating your independence within the entire business. And so what happens is people will start to be asking you things. And sooner or later, you will show the managers something that they themselves didn't know because you researched it yourself. You see, what happens is by you being able to find that information on your own, you gain a sense of independence. Another way is to be able to constantly remind yourself is that, okay, if I have this needy experience, I need to see what it feels like to pull away from the need for validation. If you do something successful, whether at home or at work, there's a scripture in the Bible that says, don't let your left hand know what your right hand's doing. Don't tell anybody. This is a thought experiment. I do this with my clients. Do something good and tell no one. What you're going to feel is this deep need for people to know, because the good itself sometimes isn't good. Sometimes we do good because we want people to say good job. And if you can get yourself to a place where you're able to do something good and not tell anybody, and I mean something big and something consistent, and not you allow yourself to speak it to anybody, you're going to feel a cognitive dissonance. You're going to feel this, I want to, but I know I shouldn't. Your job is to be able to sit in that and be able to keep your mouth closed. Because what this does is it allows you to do good for good's sake. This ties specifically to my research on motivation. Intrinsic motivation is when you're motivated to do something because you gain satisfaction in it. External motivation or extrinsic motivation is because you do it because you want reward or validation or to avoid a punishment. Extrinsic motivation doesn't make you a better person. It just makes you do what you have to do. Intrinsic motivation, that pulls you towards your passions, your purpose. It gives you clarity. And so what I try to do is get people to be more intrinsically motivated, to be able to do good for goodness sake. Then they gain the power to become independent because they don't need fuel from other people through lauding, applause, through validation, or punishment to act. They do it for themselves. This is the process of independence. It's you doing your own research, and it's you doing things for your own good rather than for the reward from other people.
Yeah, we know in business you could be a fast burner for 20 years, and then when the economic winds change, you could be gone the very next day, right? So
like that.
The idea of doing things for rewards is somewhat suspect. We know that they don't last. Certainly, if you're a good investor of money, that could be helpful, but that's just an extreme example of that. We really got to be planning and rooting ourselves in something more fundamental in our foundation, right?
Right.
And people pleasing, go after things for that reason, always leaves one feeling empty. I would argue it's just not intrinsically healthy, and it doesn't satisfy long term. But yet,
so
we've talked about this, right? We know that in marketing, right? It's about mass consumerism, and if you get something, you look a certain way, you'll get the hot woman, you'll get the hot guy, you'll get the car, you'll get the house.
Right.
It's all these snapshots of sort of events in time that brings value and joy and happiness. But certainly it's the furthest thing from the truth. So the third reason that people will ignore us from time to time is certainly because you're full of negativity, right? Nobody wants to be around a Debbie Downer.
Right.
A pessimist is not a fun person to be around. They're always down. They're always looking at the negative. They're certainly gossiping about what's not right in the world. And you don't have to look very far except for news media. I mean, I think some of the most pessimistic people on the planet with an agenda is the media and the news media, trying to control a narrative, trying to project fear, trying to project trouble, whatever it may be.
Right.
I would say nobody really wants to be around a person, ideally, that drags you down, that just takes you down that rabbit hole of despair and depression, right? So how does negativity impact our relationships, whether it be at work or whether it be personally?
Right. The first thing we have to understand is we're of two minds. We don't like negativity, obviously, because it pulls us down, but there's also some weird attraction that we have to it, right? You heard the rubberneckers when there's a car accident?
Right.
Everybody, why do you got to see it? Like what in you is just like, I'm going to I was mad at the traffic that was in front of me, right? And the traffic is because everybody's slowing down to look at it. But then when it's your turn to look at it, you slow down to look at it, right? So we have this weird kind of natural desire to look at the thing that we don't want to see. We kind of go like this, but our eyes still looking at it. And that's human nature. What's kept us alive, and I mentioned this before in the last podcast, I was talking about how we are naturally inclined to see the negative. Why? Because it's about survival. A positive thing doesn't make me live more. A positive thing just makes the living experience better. But a negative thing can kill me. And so we're naturally tuned to look at that. If I have this beautiful, sundae, ice cream sundae that's sitting in front of me with just a little bit of bird poop on it, it totally discolors the whole thing. It's no longer good, but it's just a little bit of bird poop. Even though all that great ice cream is there, that little bit of bird poop ruins it. Our minds work the same way. The day is amazing, right? I stubbed my toe. The day's bad. This person says that. The day's bad. So we have this inclination to go down the rabbit hole of negativity, right? That's a natural response. And so we have to do work to pull off that drug as well. It's not natural to us to be okay all the time. That's why people are finding problems. We're living in this incredible time to live. And people are finding problems. Now, there are absolute problems, but I'm saying on an ultimate level, if I was to go super zen with it, my heart's beating, right? The sun's where it needs to be. I say this all the time. I'm okay. But we have this tendency to go towards the negative. what the goal is to combat fire with fire. You can say water, but I'm saying with the same type of intensity. If I'm taking in negative information on a constant level, and before I mentioned we have 12 to like 80,000 negative thoughts that we're having a day, I have to use that opposite methodology. I have to start fighting back with positivity. I have to say, I am so grateful for my health. I am so grateful that I have vision and I can see a color. I'm so grateful I have a roof over my head. I'm so grateful for this breath that's keeping me alive. Without it, I'd be dead in minutes. I'm so grateful that I have water that I can pour and access. And I put myself in this space to where I feel it, because then what happens is when I rub up against those negative Nancy's or this Debbie Downers, there's got to be a man version of this. I don't like that they're all female names, but there's got to be, let's find that.
How about Downer Doug? No offense.
Downer Doug. There you go. Yeah. Defensive Doug, Downer Doug. We'll do it. You know what I mean? Right. So when we're around that, we start to see the dissonance. Remember I was talking about the radio dial? You turn the radio dial to positivity. But then what happens when you hear a frequency that's not yours, you'll be more quick to pull away from that space. But the truth is, usually what happens if I hear the negative frequency, I'm like, yeah, I totally agree with that negative frequency. And I turn my frequency to that person's frequency. So the first work I have to do is internal. I have to turn my frequency to that which is positive. That's why my morning ritual is the most important thing. I mentioned it. I have a book that I'm going to be putting out called Bulletproof Mornings, right? And what it's talking about is how to prepare your morning so that your radio dial is on you being successful in the world. It doesn't mean be ignorant. In no way does it mean be ignorant and forget the difficult and the trials that are in the world. But what it says is that I create this film of my love for myself and my existence. And then I go in and become a servant in those spaces. I don't need to turn my frequency to that frequency in order to do the good work that I need to do. But when I'm empathetic, I'll allow myself to feel sadness. I'll feel what I feel, but I'm keeping control over that energy. So it's really important to fight fire with fire by providing that positive thinking to yourself and constantly be going through your gratitudes, and then finding other people that are in that space, not ignorant, not naive, because that's a tricky thing too. Sometimes positivity can ignore the things that are going on in the world, but really pulling together that group of people is extremely important. And then being a leader where you're at the bottom in the sea, so the streams can come to you because you have source to help other people with.
Yeah, that's right. And, I want to go back again, the root cause of negative thoughts, and certainly it could be fight or flight. It's the whole idea we want to survive, and obviously the negative cues in life give us some important feedback of where we're at. If we were in Ramadi, Iraq, when we were, I guess it was in the early 2000s, during Desert Storm, I believe, and the wars that just proceeded from that, Ramadi was a very dangerous place. And the idea of keeping going back to the same location and getting the same results would have happened if there wasn't intelligence and thoughtfulness around the environment, what was going on. And to me, it's about root cause. And so it could be fight or flight. It could be adjusting strategy. I think ultimately it's about awareness at some level, where you say, at some point in my life, I went through some experiences that just crushed my confidence or gave me this negative view of the world because maybe I was abused. Maybe I was economically disadvantaged. I mean, and by the way, we all tell ourselves stories.
Right.
And we get stuck in our story, and we start to have this inner dialogue about what we're worthy of and what we should have and what we shouldn't have. And to me, when we think about the root cause of why we're negative and why we see the world this way, right, it seems to me that it's so vital at certain levels to be mindful, sort of pull back up to 30,000 feet, look at the big picture, maybe in the context of your life, to say, this was a trigger point. This was an inflection point in my life where, X, Y, and Z happened. I remember my dad, up until about 10 years of age, I was kind of happy-go-lucky and always a goofball. I was always joking, laughing, until my mother died. Mm-hmm. And at that point, he saw a shift in my personality. And I was still fun and, all that, but I was more serious. Right. And it took my dad to have that observation to say, hey, it was about this time where I saw this transition. So I think there's an opportunity in all of us to say, if I have this perspective and experience in life and I'm feeling a certain way, to figure out and uncork why it is. Because to me, it's like the 12-step program of AA, right?
Right.
First, I got to admit I have a problem. And at some level, you're going back saying, is it my childhood? What is it that triggered that event? And certainly I know that alcoholism is a disease. There's no question about it. But, I know I've heard guys speak that, I had that first beer. I watched my dad have a beer and I snuck one and I was hooked. They didn't know they had that gene.
Right.
But somewhere along the line, there was abuse or something going on.
Right.
And to me, Burke, it's such a rich opportunity to look at it and say, what is the root cause of being negative in my life? Because I think I think if we're honest, look, we're going to have tough times. It's inevitable. The idea
Right.
that we have these nice houses, a big bank account. I've met more rich people, wealthy people that are abjectly miserable. So we know that money doesn't bring the happiness, but we know we're going to have, tough times along the way. And sort of the kind of the analogy I would draw is we could be that lighthouse. I mean,
Yeah.
vision a
Right.
lighthouse with a massive storm trying to guide in ships.
Right.
What is the purpose of your life can be rooted in something that's magical, that's groundbreaking, that's transformational. Like that guy in Tiananmen Square that they call him Tank Man. They don't even know who he is.
Right.
But it transformed the world and the review of repressive regimes, right? Just like that lighthouse transforms the vision of seafarers or people on ships trying to get into the harbor.
That's so perfect, man. And I'm very, very, very passionate about this. And I love it. I know you're passionate about it too, because we know that we know we're both here to do work, right? We're both here to do work and empower people in some way. It's not like we're getting paid millions of dollars to have this conversation. We really believe in this, right? We really believe in that lighthouse, being that lighthouse and meeting other lighthouses and spreading that light to other people. And it's so interesting because just like you said, when I do my work, it's about core value, like core beliefs. What are the core issues in you, the core story about your unworthiness, your inability to be worthy of love, your inability to think that you're capable of achieving anything? And what it is a conversation, what I call is with your child self. And what happens is there's a period in time, just as you were talking about, where we stopped believing. Like, when did you stop believing? When did you doubt yourself? And for you, you're talking about with the passing of your mother, all of a sudden you went from this place of joy and excitement. And the pain of a fall is from the height. If you're happy, the higher your happiness, the harder the fall to sadness, right? And so we create stories in those places of protection. How do we prevent ourselves from being in this type of position again? Don't ever get that happy again. For me, like that, the same type of stories happen in me. And they can happen in the most menial ways. I used to play baseball. Like, I was probably about, I would say maybe 8 years old playing baseball. I got beamed twice in the thigh in one game. From that moment on, I couldn't step into the plate. I couldn't do it. My dad would be like, step into the plate, step into the plate. I think I was actually younger because I remember I was probably like 6 or 7. They were like, step into the plate. And I couldn't step into the plate. I couldn't do it. And so what happened was every time that I would pretend to step into the plate, I would step out just enough. And what I wanted to look like, I wanted it to look like I was trying to hit the ball. But the truth was I was trying not to get hit. And so all of a sudden I went from loving baseball to being terrified of baseball. Every time that I was in the dugout ready to go next, I was terrified of it. And what I realized later is that my story is step into the plate, Burke. Sometimes I make it look like I'm trying. I make it look like I'm trying to get that sale, right? But I stepped back, right? When I first started my business when I was younger, I was just like, I don't want to get hit. I don't want them to say no. So how do I make it look like I swing without the real hit? Because I had a core belief that I'll get hurt, that I'll get hit, that I won't hit, I'll get hit. And so that story then reshapes the way that you move in the world. And we have no idea what this change does over our lives. And every single one of us, every one of my clients, I don't care whether you're a CEO or if I'm doing it pro bono, all of us have stories, specifically one story that changed that narrative of who we are. And so my work is, how do I get back and find out what that story was and change the story? All I really have to say is, Burke, you were 7 years old. That's not how life, that's just, you were scared of being hit. That's okay. But for you to turn it into a rule of life, for you to make it, okay, this is the new story. I think it was Freud or Jung, I'm not sure. He said the child is father to the man. What that means is the child sets the rules for the adult, because my child existed longer than my adult self has. So when I got hit, my child self set a rule, and the rule was, hey, don't try fully because you might get hit. And then what happens is I start to live by that design. And not until I go back to my child self and say, I appreciate the rule of protection. I know you were doing it to stop us from being hurt, but I need to take the wheel now. And I need to make a shift in how this works. All my clients have to do this. It's called writing a letter to your child self. Not to reject it, but to say, I love you. I appreciate what you've done. I appreciate that you've taken care of me, but this no longer works. I take a boat to get across the river. I don't pick the boat up on the bank and walk with it over my head. Once I've gotten to the other side of the river, I leave the boat. This belief no longer serves me. I move on. And that's where the power is at, because when we can erase those core stories of how the world works, of what we believe we are, then we can truly be that lighthouse you're talking about.
Well, that's so true, Burke. I mean, it's profound, but it's true. A lot of stories shape us for good and bad, for better or better, right? And it's so profound and powerful. So I think another reason why people ignore us is we tend to worry too much about what people, or about being liked, right? We really obsess about being liked. I mean, think about the culture we're in with looking good, feeling good, hair, makeup, nails, and these are not criticisms. Or the car or the house. We will go to epic lengths to have a certain car, or epic lengths to have a certain house, to the detriment of our relationships with our kids or our wife or our husband, or whatever it may be. But the idea about being liked is so profound in Western culture. Again, I was watching this episode on China, and in the villages of China, they probably don't care so much about that. You don't see nail salons in the corner. You just don't. It's a rural area, right?
Mm-hmm.
They have a different way of looking at the world. Or we talked last week about Fiji, where they have epic poverty, yet they're epically happy. One amongst the happiest people on the planet Earth. So we worry so much about being liked. And what does that do to people? I think it pushes people away. It feels superficial, not authentic, right? And ultimately, I would say that people pleasers aren't a lot of fun to be around, because if you're around them, you want to have a real conversation. If they're telling you what you want to hear, where do you learn and grow on that, right? Where's the growth in interaction? So in your experience and your studies, what are some practical steps that can be taken to change this people-pleasing approach?
Yeah. People pleasing it's a desire to be liked, right? That's just like you're saying. You have to find something more important than the reward you get from being liked. And the only time to find something more important than the reward you get from being liked is finding your purpose, finding your passion. Because when you find your purpose and your passion, you won't sacrifice that. You'll sacrifice anything else. You will contort yourself into whatever you need to contort yourself in order to be liked. Now, it kind of works. There's actually, I would say at the same time, there's a polar or a ricochet from that. And this is interesting and important too, because there's people who are rebellious. Rebellious people think that what they're doing is rebelling from a specific thing, but it's actually a ricochet too. So people who are striving to be liked want to be accepted and blessed by these people. And then some people who don't feel that they can be accepted or blessed by these people, they'll do the exact opposite, right? As a revolt against them. The truth is both of those are sicknesses, because this one says, I want to get the love. And this one's like, I can't get the love, so I will get the hate. And so what happens is you're on the same platform, just moving to polar opposites, but both are controlled by the response of the people over here, whether it's your parents or society or whatever. The true way to gain freedom is not through rebelliousness and not through conformity. It's through purpose. When you have purpose, you no longer care whether it seems rebellious. You no longer care whether it seems like something that people like, because it'll oscillate between all of them. You look at Muhammad Ali, he was loved and hated, but at the end he was loved. But what happens when you are so clear on what you're trying to create, you just go towards that. And that is where freedom is. That's why my work is to get you to be clear on who you are and who you're not, because no longer will you be a slave to the expectations of other people, because even being rebellious is a slavery, because you're doing it to get a result or reaction out of the people that won't love you the way you want to be loved. So truly, it's about finding purpose. It's about knowing your passion, because then you're willing to do whatever. Once you find what you're willing to die for, you have what you're willing to live for. Once you find what your purpose is, then you can express it irreverent and regardless of who thinks what about it, because those who resonate on that frequency will turn to it. That's freedom.
I mean, my head's spinning right now. I've never heard it put that way. The two extremes, right? You got rebellion or acceptance. I want to be loved, so I'll go along to get along, or I'm not getting it, so I'm going to rebel and try to shock the people closest to me. And I think this is a dynamic we see time and time again in families.
Absolutely.
It's complete, right? And the idea now of focusing on purpose. And I would argue that is just so profound, Burke, because it's all about purpose. But we have to appreciate that through every stage of our lives, the purpose is going to change, right? Maybe at one point I wanted to be a pilot, and then it changed to something else. And then I wanted to get married and have kids. And the purpose is ever dynamic. And I think it's about, and you said this many times, getting to know yourself, being sure of who you are, what you believe in, and why you believe in it, because that purpose will change. The intrinsic motivation of what drove us in our 20s will be fundamentally different of what drives us in our 40s and 50s and 60s. But boy, that what you said is just like, that could be a book, because I think everybody struggles with parental approval, or, you know what, part of parenting is the kid wants to grow up and have their own identity.
Right.
They want to establish who they are. And sometimes they do it in a healthy way, and sometimes they do it in a very unhealthy way, right?
Right.
But I think the magnet of purpose, that is so profound, and the way you put that, compliments to you, my man, because I've never heard it put that way. But you really talk about it divided in the center is
Yeah.
that sort of magnet that can draw us to our better angels, our better
Yes.
beings, and our better purpose.
You know, there's a great quote. It says that pain pushes until the vision pulls. And as we discover who we are, we have to make wrong choices. It's okay. It's part of life, and the rebelliousness of children, that's part of it. And as a parent, it's for us to understand, oh, they're just like you said, trying to define themselves. And sometimes they must go against, by law, they must go against us in order for them to understand what they are. And our love kind of covers that space as well. But at the same time, it's this pain that pushes us. And once you capture the vision, that's what pulls us. Whoa. That was crazy. That's what pulls us, right? That's what moves us to the place where all of a sudden we are no longer worried about using the individuals as stepping stones to finding ourselves. We actually are drawn by our own purpose. And just like you said, the purpose does change. I would say it transforms. I think it's the same energy, but it transforms over time. Because ultimately our purpose is to be loved and to give love, right? Our purpose is to express ourselves as beautifully as we can. My vision statement encompasses pretty much every version of me chronologically up until this point, at least. Even my youth, when my purpose was just to play with my toys, my vision statement says boundless imagination and creativity. That exists there. When I'm making my programs, boundless imagination and creativity, it shows up in different ways to express my unique greatness in the world and allow others to express their unique greatness in the world. There's so many different ways those missions can show up in the world. But the power is when we know who we are, then we don't need to bounce up against other people or be loved by other people to validate it. We just exist. And that is freedom, man, because then you get to just create boundlessly this magical experience of life.
Yeah, it's interesting. You said pain pushes until I guess
Vision
the
pulls.
intrinsic motivation pulls, right?
Right.
And so the idea of that, I think about what's going on in America, and I kind of go back to it because it's real for a lot of people. It's relatable, right? And there's a lot of people going through their own painful experiences now, and I think we have this distortion field, whether it's the media trying to push an agenda for the presidential elections or whether it's in marketing. There's this distortion field where people are trying to create a reality, and it's all unreality, right? That's why people go through these stages and they realize, man, I put my ladder against this wall, and it was just abjectly not fulfilling. It just didn't do what I thought it would do. So I like what you had to say there, because the idea of kind of going through those painful experiences, I use sort of the terminology living ugly. Sometimes you have to live ugly to understand what you had and where you want to go. And I totally buy into the idea that people have to figure out on their own. I mean, the idea that a parent can force fit a child in a certain direction and then leverage money to get that child to comply is really missing a big opportunity. The opportunity is to really let that kid experience it. If they're pushing back, let them go. Create a vacuum. I remember I was working with this therapist one time, not for me, but for another situation. And he was telling me that, the biggest growth comes from the vacuum that a parent can create with their child, which is really the antithesis of how most parents sort of interact with their children, right? It's all about control. Here's the outcome. Here, look, we know more than you. So therefore, if you take these steps, you'll end up here. But yet the kid's just pushing back and rejecting that idea. So the idea of a vacuum and just pulling away and letting that individual make their own choice, sometimes fall flat. There is a gift in that pain, if you will, that pushes them to their purpose.
You know what? This is so real. And this is something that I do want to teach individuals that have children as well, because it's human nature at the end of the day. It's not like it's the way humans respond. I mean, you look at the prodigal son. The story of the prodigal son is a perfect example. Kid's like, give me my inheritance, even though you're not dead, give me my inheritance. And the kid goes off and spends it on wild living, right? Just parties, prostitution, all this different stuff. And then he goes broke. And then he's working to feed pigs. And he just wishes that he could eat the food of the pigs. And then he's like, you know what? What have I done? I could go and work as a servant to my father. At least he'll take me in as a servant and I can at least eat. So it says that he starts coming back. He's walking back. And it says, while he was a long way off, his father saw him and ran to him. Out of all the story, everybody talks about the prodigal son. I'm thinking about the dad. First off, the dad said, here, take the inheritance. He gave him the freedom to go into the darkness, right? He gave him that freedom because he trusted him and God. Then he comes back. And while he's coming back, the guy is looking for his son probably every day out there looking for him with hope in his eyes. And then when he comes, what does he do? He hugs him. And the son's like, let me be a servant. He's like, shut up, put a ring on him. We're celebrating. Because this type of understanding is that it's about, all we are stewards of children. These are full complex beings that are supremely nuanced. And to think that just because it came from my DNA, I understand how to make it work.
Not
no,
close, right?
Every one of the children are completely different in every single way and shape. And there's a quote that I love, and it says, tyranny is the deliberate removal of nuance. When you remove nuance, when you say it's either right or wrong, black or white, it's this or that, when you do that to a child or you do that in the world, what happens is you remove this ability for people to question themselves, to learn from their mistakes, to be able to make choices that are wrong and right and come to their own fashioned understanding of truth. Your job is to set the foundation. The foundation is towards a goodness of heart and empathy towards other, right? An understanding of justice and mercy. And then let them blossom from that space. Then from there, you can let them create the nuance. I have a nephew who is just so wild. He's so hyper, and everybody's trying to bring him down. And I'm like, just have him go outside and get the energy out. When he gets the energy out, then he becomes more quote unquote normal, which is just an adult, and all adults are just boring versions of kids. So what happens is you allow that kid to experience his nuance and be his child's self. They will figure out how to work it. And when you empower them by having the faith to do that and the knowledge to allow them to have that nuance and allow you to, as a parent, have that nuance, then you create a freedom within them to trust their own internal radio dial, right? Their own guidance. That's all our job is. We want to give them the right compass. This is north. And once they have that, you let them live. Powerful way to exist. Difficult, but powerful.
No, it's very difficult because there's a lot of dogma, there's a lot of beliefs, there's a lot of religions, and it's just torn the fabric on so many levels. And I think, when you think about people in their 60s and 70s, why are they so wise, assuming they had kids, is they've gone through this experience and they try to control, they try to do whatever they try to do. And it's funny how God brings kids into your life to steward and shepherd, and how you grow as an adult. People are like in their 40s thinking they know everything, right? We've all met them, and that's okay. Then they hit their 50s and they're like, wow. And then 60s, and every decade that wisdom quotient just continues to grow, because you have those encounters with kids that are just skulls full of mush that you're supposed to love and shepherd. And you said it so right, because that's all you really can do ultimately, because otherwise the energy trying to be put towards control is completely exhausting. And completely gets you nowhere. And I think the idea of letting it be, creating that vacuum, letting them expose and experience, and understanding that there are standards in life. And I always liken it to, it's like life and personal life is a lot like a business. And I know people have always bristled when I say that, like, how can you compare personal life, your relationships, to business? And this is how I compare it, because in business there's standards. There's standards of conduct, there's standards of talk, there's standards of interaction that we're supposed to follow, sort of social norms. And sometimes you see that broken down in the personal realm. I remember I was going for jury duty, and there's a young man in there that went around Irvine slashing tires and doing all this mayhem. I'm looking at this kid going, how does the mind think that that's okay, right? How is that even possible in what was going on? And yet you realize that people go through their experiences, and the system will speak into their life, whether it's the legal system, the parental system. But the reality is kids need to go figure it out. And they need to go on that little journey. And I think the best thing that parents can do is let them, and not try to control, and not try to have an outcome in mind. Because, here's the problem. And President Trump just signed an executive order last week saying that it's not about a college degree, that if you have vocation and excellence and a skill, we're going to consider you on the same level as a person with a degree. That's a beautiful thing for working America. I remember Rick Warren talking one time. He's like, the problem with education is you stick a kid in a box, a square box, and he's a circle.
Yes.
And you're saying this is how you're going to learn. It's going to through rote memorization. Sorry. Rote memorization. And you got to do it this way, and then regurgitate and throw up what you learn. And the reality is people learn many different ways. I'm a visual learner, for example. So they learn through sight and repetition and observing, and maybe through math and through any number of means. So the idea that we pigeonhole somebody in a certain way of doing things is really missing the opportunity. It's really about let the kid figure out his gift or gifts and let him go express it. Now, obviously, parents want to make sure they don't go off the rails and go too far where, drunk driving, death, and right? Those are obvious ones. But I think by and large, the issue is people want to control. And when you
Right.
have young skulls full of mush from 0 to 8, Burke,
Yeah.
and guess what? Up to about 10, they salute. Up to about
Right.
maybe even 12, they salute.
Right.
Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am. And all of a sudden, boom,
Boom.
they get their
Boom.
own thoughts around
Yeah,
12
exactly.
and 13, maybe even younger. And then they start to push back on what you thought you knew.
And then they think that they're the one that knows it all. You know, it's interesting, and I love what you were talking about, Rick Warren too. Warren, the one of the things that I always say is when you look at the word educate, it comes from the Latin root educo, and that is not to put in. I think it was Paulo Freire. He's talking about this in Pedagogy of the Oppressed. A lot of times what happens is knowledge goes into the mind, but true education, and this is the work that we're about. This is why I'm like, okay, my job is to educate, as this Latin word is really mean. What it means is to draw out. Right? How do you draw out? And as we look at, as parents, when we look as managers, because it's the same thing, even with me to my clients, it's not always this parental, but there's a parental energy to it. God the Father, God the Son, right? There's this parental energy that's showing. It's the mentor, the one who's been here, that wants to express, that wants to understand or help understand. But it's to draw out, and that's where you ask questions. That's why the Socratic method is so powerful. That's why my work is all about the Socratic method. If I literally inserted all my thoughts right into people, or what I call thought seeds, if I just planted all these thought seeds in people, what happens is I'm robbing them of their ability to grow. I'm robbing them of their ability to become their own version of it. That's why when I work on their values, I don't say, oh, don't you think it's this? No, I just ask questions. I put them in the space where I'm like, well, prove to me that it is what it is. Prove to me that's your vision. Prove to me that's what you care about. And then they're like, and they want me to give them an answer. And I'm like, no, prove it to me. Because all I'm doing is I'm testing the integrity of your space. And in the same way, as parents, as managers, what we do is we draw out, what do you think about this situation? Okay, here's the protocol. Here's how it goes. What do you think about it? You draw it out. And it's just like you said, in the organization, it works the same in the personal. And the funny thing is, in the personal, it works the same as the organism. And that's why I'm saying I always follow nature, because nature did it right. The way that nature, the ecosystem of my body is incredible. The bacteria that's in me, the virus that's in me, at the same time, the white blood cells, the red blood cells, the sinew, the bone, everything. For me to just even have this conversation in live, this is incredible, but it's taken time. It's through multiple failures over so much time that has created this rendition of us, right? And so that power is the same power we want to have extrapolated and put into the familial power, and then into the corporate power, then into the communal world power, because all of a sudden we put ourselves into a place where we understand that ultimately Earth is an organism, right? And we're some cells on it. And we all have to be working in a space to where we're keeping it healthy, right?
Boy, can we be a messy group of cells.
Right, exactly, man. Or a cancer, geez. That's just, you know what I mean?
Funny,
we're figuring it out.
You know, that Socratic method is so powerful. We think about this political dynamic and divide in America, and even with kids, I'd argue it's an important strategy. So if someone says, you know, person X is a racist, or person Y is this or that, if you simply say, well, why is it that you believe that? What evidence do you have that suggests that's the case? And you start asking the why. Help me understand. Let's dig into it. It does two things. It informs you, right? Yeah. Learn something new, and maybe it informs your thinking about what they know and what they don't know.
Absolutely.
Right? So simply asking why, as opposed to reacting in our monkey brain, right, limbic rich system, and trying to go to the cerebral cortex. I think that's what you said is spot on, Burke. And I think it's true in relationships. You can fly off the handle when you saw something that triggers something else in your relationship, as opposed to you could take the alternative of saying, well, why? Why'd you feel that way? What were you thinking? What happened to you this day?
We mentioned that too when we were talking about managing promises. Like, hey, so what was it that happened? As opposed to you did this wrong. What was it that happened? You know, and I think that that's something that's really, really powerful, to be able to just come from an inquisitive, curious space, right? And just like the thing, I do diversity work as well. So it's not so much like if somebody says, okay, this person's racist, we're like, okay, let's ask the why questions. Or this person says, I'm not racist. Okay, let's ask the why questions. Because ultimately what the goal is how do we get to a better understanding of behaviors that are beneficial and behaviors that are not beneficial? And so what happens is when we're in a place of high threat level, right? High aggression level, high fear level, we get into the you are and you are not, or I'm not. And all of a sudden it becomes this identity game. But what we come to is this place of, okay, we're human. why do you feel this way? Why don't you feel? And then we come down to more of the nuanced things. And that takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of work. When I'm a manager and I'm looking at this guy who he didn't send me the reports. What was it? I forgot. It was Office Space, great movie. But I need those TP reports. But you didn't get the TP reports. They didn't come, right? Instead of me saying, you didn't do your job, I have to ask, what happened? And then they're going to come up with their excuses. And I'll be smart enough to be able to realize what's an excuse versus what's real. And then I'm like, okay, well, why did this happen? Why did this happen? And they'll come up to realize, oh, it's because I didn't do this. And I'm like, okay, what could you do next time to ensure that this doesn't happen again? What you're doing is you're putting all of the energy in them, because if they don't do it the next time, the cognitive dissonance is there. They can't. I've had it once, man. And this is when I was working with this large printing company, and there was an unruly employee. And I was talking to the owner, and I'm like, you don't need to fire him. Forgive the sounds. I'm like underwater right now. But I'm like, you don't need to fire him. And what I said was, we talked to him and said, hey, if these three things happen, do you think that these three actions are worthy of you being able to work here? We had a conversation. And he's like, no, if I do A, B, and C, then absolutely I get how that can be problematic. And so I said, okay, so and this wasn't me, he was talking, I told the owner, to be like, hey, if this doesn't happen, does that mean that you don't want to work here anymore? And he's like, I would agree on that. So what happened was, it was his own words that were put on the wall. And that if he checked it off, he was firing himself in essence, right? Because he didn't keep his own promises that he kept with himself. And ultimately, if we can get to a place where we can teach people to think in a way where they're like, you know what, my actions were wrong, my actions were right, then we don't have to be the bad guy that comes in. We can ask Socratic questions to unearth what the real issues are, deal with them as necessary, or just realize, you know what, you're not a value fit here, and we're not a value fit for you. So maybe you can take your skill sets and work in another place that's more fitting for you. This changes the game. It's no longer just amputate, cut off, yell, scream. It's let's ask some questions.
Well, I think in America, what's happening is we're the Happy Meal generation, right? It's
microwave.
packaged.
Yeah, that's what I say. Absolutely.
I don't have to think much.
Absolutely.
And I can react to everything.
Bad guy, good guy. Bad guy, good guy, good thing, bad. Nobody wants to vote in their community. Nobody wants to. It's just very difficult because we live in this social media world, man. And this is what's causing it. The social media is putting us in these echo chambers that are robbing us from being able to have these amazing thoughts. It goes back to what we were talking about with Tocqueville, where the communal conversations, where we can get in the difficult conversations and lovingly try to figure out an answer, you know?
Yeah, it's interesting. I was watched this thing on the Uyghurs in China, the ethnic minority, which is a Muslim minority, and even China at large. And it's kind of worrisome because I think it's where it's going to go around the world. It's a surveillance state, right? And you look at America, and we can argue that we're surveilling social media. We're calling balls and strikes winners or losers, but it's progressive. And the thing that concerns me about what's going on in China is they have this thing called social credits. And so they have this standard based on some criteria. Right. That if you match up to it, you're in the good, and if you don't, it's not good. And they'll take you away and they'll put you in prison camps. And they have technology that can look at your mood. Are you happy? Are you stressed? Do you have anxiety? Do you look angry? If you're angry or stressed, they'll literally pick you up and take you in for questioning. So you hear about that and you say, well, that's in China. But I'd argue with human nature, don't be so certain about that, because after Tiananmen Square, they did two things, right? They cracked down on dissent, they increased the surveillance state, and then they increased the economic opportunity, certainly in the cities.
And they erased the history. And they erased the If you mention Tiananmen Square they won't know it.
Yeah, you go Google in China, there's nothing about it. And the Tank Man, they don't know anything about it. So what is concerning when I watch this is I can extrapolate and say, in America, we think that we have rights and liberties and freedoms. But when man gets in control, and if they could have their way, people like power and they want to stay in power. And the idea of surveilling the state to make sure we get the people we like and we get rid of the people we don't like is certainly concerning. Not to get too off topic here, but
no, it's dystopian.
But it's real.
It's this is something that is, the technology has become more prevalent, and it has become. It's happening. Elon Musk. This is what I do love about him with the whole Neuralink thing that he's doing. He's trying to combat AI by democratizing it, right? Because AI, whoever has AI, it's game over ultimately, right? Because that's not even playing chess. That's playing like space chess. You know what I mean?
Right.
It's at a different level, but it is happening now because at the same way, you had the NSA that was, cracking down on finding, I mean, you can pull anything out. And then with certain laws saying like, with the Patriot Act, you're like, hey, you're a terrorist. It's like, boom, there you go. No citizen rights.
Right.
So it's
a slippery slope.
It's a slippery slope. There's a Black Mirror episode that literally does this exact social credit thing. And when you watch it, I wish I remember the name of it. It's terrifying because literally you lose credits just as people review you. If other people negatively review you, you lose power or credits to purchase, to be able to go to certain places. And slowly but surely, it's an incredible tyranny that is so nuanced that it's practically, I mean, you lose this power. I forgot it was Foucault who talked about it, but it's like this all-seeing eye where you are terrified to even speak about a thing, right?
Well, China, they have this technology where you go into any store and you're going to buy something, or if you want credit, they can approve you credit in 8 seconds. They can approve you for credit in 8 seconds for lots of money. And the way they do is they have an algorithm that looks at over 500,000 characteristics, including, do you charge your cell phone? They found that people who don't charge a cell phone aren't as trustworthy and aren't as credit worthy.
Oh my
It's
God.
from an algorithm standpoint.
I did not know that. That's nuts.
No, so they'll approve in 8 seconds if you sort of match up to their criteria. But literally, do you charge your cell phone? And then they have all these other factors like how did you sign the form? So they got AI looking at how hard you press, how vigorous you are. They can pick up emotions by your handwriting in the moment. I mean, so in one hand, you say, cool, I got approved in 8 seconds if you meet the criteria. So
Right.
The whole point is they would argue that what oil is to the Middle East is what data is to China. That's the new gold, right?
Yeah.
AI.
I mean, yeah. And, that's
and they lead the world in it. So this kind of goes back to what we were saying about, worrying about being liked. I think there's going to be bigger fish to fry in the future where you have a computer algorithm that fundamentally change your life. And I'd argue if there's money to be made, it'll find its way to America. The surveillance state, what you see happening with the rioting and knocking down statues, I will argue, just trust me, in time, you're going to see proposals. Well, we can't have cops around everywhere, so let's put in cameras like they've done in Britain.
It's going to happen.
Be Orwellian. It's going to be 1984, in the next 10 years in America.
I think this is what I think. I think that no matter what happens, everything is an opportunity. This is not about because of A, B happens. It doesn't matter. The variable is A. The variable is 9/11 happens, the Patriot Act happens, right? So certain things, it doesn't matter what happens. It's the agenda of being able to, and the only thing to stop it, and when I say stop it or at least slow it down, are people becoming more nuanced in themselves. And like we were saying, how do you be liked? It always comes back to the same thing. You have to wake your internal self up. That is where it starts. It always starts on the individual. If we understand, if we become more aware of what's happening, if we become not caught up in these unnecessary stories of this or that, if we say, what is my job now with me and those that I love? To wake up, because then I won't need to be liked, which means I don't need to conform, right? So my mind is thinking, any type of protest, I'm like, okay, protesting is good. That's great. But what can we do individually? What can we do internally to look at these greater systems that you're talking about, right? That could be coming here to our shores. And how do we enact and stop these type of things from taking over our freedoms? Because ultimately what the goal is of big government is to take over everyone's freedoms, because anybody that dissents becomes a threat or a minority report. So what is happening is we have to all understand that we have to do our own internal work. We have to become more educated. We have to become more aware of our surroundings, more sensate, more nuanced, more frontal cortex, and be able to engage in dialogue and ameliorate things as quickly as possible so we can deal with the bigger issues that are at hand. But most of those issues, nobody sees, nobody's experiencing, right? Yeah. So to be liked is to first love yourself, right? That's where it starts.
Well, I guess we're talking about what reasons why we're ignored, and then we have this conversation about reasons why government doesn't ignore you. So it's about being aware of nuance at some level. So the other reason, the fifth reason why people tend to ignore us is we don't take anything seriously. And I kind of harken back to online dating, and the person shows up, they're like nothing like their picture or their weight or whatever, excuse me, they describe themselves, right? And it's the whole idea that when someone shows up and they present themselves to the other person, if you don't take the other person's time seriously and what you share with that person about who you are, right?
Mm.
If you don't have a reputation for keeping promises or always flanking on commitments with your friends, right? Excuse me.
Mm-hmm.
Or you show up late constantly, then you'd be surprised why you shouldn't be surprised why people ignore you. I mean, I can tell you many times in my life in business, one of the things you learn in the military, it's always about punctuality, right? And you see a lot of times where people aren't taking your time seriously. And that's kind of the online dating example, or in business, they show up radically late, right? And this shows people that you do not respect them or their time, right? So the idea, it's funny, I go back, I've talked to many people about the online dating experience. It's like, this guy shows up, he's 20 years older, he's 150 pounds heavier, and he's like, what's the problem here? I mean, come on, what's the problem, right? Right. And it all goes back to being honest and respectful of people's time and taking the process, shall we say, seriously. So what does your research say, how this lackadaisical attitude, how does it develop in the first place, and where is it rooted in? I mean, how does all this start?
It's really, we're so complex, man. I'm going to give you an example to kind of like counter that, right? The punctuality, that this is, so people value people that value them. Going back to codependency, fashionably late, right? Everybody wants to get there a little bit late because you're the most important person in the room, right? And people give it to them. They give them the space to be like, well, they're busy, so they value that person, right? And so it all depends on if you value yourself. In a codependent relationship, you don't value yourself. So if a person doesn't value you, they're doing just what they're supposed to because you're not worthy in your own mind. So a person can take advantage of that, right? So if you're looking for relationships that are healthy, then of course, these type of things are very, very powerful. Respecting another person. And there's a book that I read. It's called How to Have Power and Confidence in Dealing with People. And one of the things that was so important that I got out of this book, it was just it was a small portion, but it was something that was really important. It said, people like people that let them talk about themselves. When you let a person talk about themselves, after the conversation is done, even if you've only, like me personally, I'm listening to them the whole time, they're talking about themselves, and I only get like 5 words out. They're going to walk away being like, Burke is an incredible person, right? They're just going to be amazed by him because people enjoy to talk about themselves. And so in the game of, and I'm kind of I push back a little bit on the, on certain expectations of if this, then that. For example, there's, as I've done work, I've realized that sometimes, like, for example, punctuality. I agree with punctuality. I think punctuality is a beautiful thing. But I've also seen incredible people because they weren't on time. And I mean, like 15 minutes late is different, 5 minutes. But if they weren't on time, they still have incredible skill sets. Because people that aren't punctual sometimes are very creative, right? Because they constantly believe, they're very optimistic. They believe they have more time. They're always believing that I can do it. That mindset worked within a nice context can actually get them to push beyond a deadline or before, like, hey, we can do it faster. So what happens is the nuances are so, like I said, complex. And what it really is this: do you feel the person values you? Not so much if the person's on time, then they don't value you, but do I feel that the person values me? Do I see that I'm an asset in their life and they're an asset in mine? And do I see, because what happens is then all of a sudden you have this diversity of thinking. Now, obviously you set rules like, hey, if you're late, you're late. This is what happens. But I've had people that I've worked with that I manage that have this difficult time getting in on time, but they're incredible salespeople and they draw the team together in such a great way. So I'm like, okay, I'm going to have to give you, like, you're going to get written up if you don't do this. So I want you to work on this, but I'll give you a little bit of a cushion. You have a 5-minute cushion. This does wonders for their psyches. And so what happens is, as long as the value is there, as long as that understanding of mutual respect is there, then all of a sudden people feel important. And that's really what our job is. In order for me to be remembered, in order for me not to be ignored, in order for me to be liked, and for people at the end, which is the goal for me, to be followed or at least to enlist in the journey that I'm upon, is for them to believe that I care about them. And that's what it is for me. When I talk to people, I only see them. People can walk in, say things, I'm here, and they feel it. And that power, people remember. They remember it. And then I think that that's one of the most important things to do, to get people to see, like, hey, I care about you. And if somebody says, hey, you know what, you need to do A, B, and C if you care about me, then I'll make the adjustments as best as I can while still honoring my own personality. this is where you create this mutual dynamic between very different people that still feel connected, still feel important, still feel loved, and can grow together.
You know, it's interesting when I think about why people don't take things seriously. I also think it's rooted in ego, right? Oversized ego, oversized or undersized accomplishments, depending on what they've gone
Right.
through in life. Maybe it's like I was listening to this guy one time talk about Navy SEAL. Now, to become a Navy SEAL in Navy SEAL Team 6, you're the
Mm,
best, the best, the best, the best. Well, if
right.
that guy's out of SEAL Team 6 and he goes in another job, is he supposed to his hat on the fact that he wasn't SEAL Team 6?
Mm,
His next job, he just sort of shows up and, hey, I'm the SEAL guy, my history, that this is what I've done. Or you say, well, that was in your history, but we're going to evaluate you where you're at today. I
right.
think a lot of people come in there and don't take things seriously because at some
Mm,
level they're insecure, or they have an overinflated sense of self,
oof.
or they feel they go in a situation, maybe the knowledge base, there's a huge gap in what they know and what's required to effectively do the job or sell that product. And so they kind of toss it off as
So real.
nonchalant, not a big deal, as a way to cope with an environment that's highly stressful. So
Mm,
uh, I'm sure you come across that in your research. So what are some things that people can do to become aware
mm.
that they're showing up and not taking it serious? Because I think there are a lot of people that are pressing the edge of the envelope. They're engaged, they're in the game,
Yeah.
they're in the fight, they're in a startup, and they're working 80 hours a week, right?
Right.
And then this person comes in like a ne'er-do-well, lackadaisical. In fact, there's a colleague I worked with in a startup that I brought him in there and didn't take anything serious, and he was fired by the CEO, and he was shocked,
Yeah.
and he didn't have the awareness of, hey man, how you're showing up. I mean, we're not talking 15 minutes late, 2 hours late. It was like banker
Okay.
hours personified, like, 10
Right.
to 2
Okay.
in a
This is, yeah.
startup, right?
You know what? This is the perfect example. We could just put this into a single profile. Millennial, right? When you look at millennials, they think they could be the CEO by week 3, right? There's this idea that it's the medallion. Everybody gets a medallion. The loser gets a medallion. The winner gets a medallion. Middle place you get a medallion. Everybody gets this win. So it's this constantly rewarding behavior that is not merit based. Merit based reward is important. Millennials, in a lot of ways, it's very well. At least I think they've come to realization, because now they're in the workforce and they're realizing it's not as easy as it was. But a lot of the work that I used to talk about was bridging the gap between these baby boomers, right, the Gen Xers and the millennials, because millennials have such this high optimistic view of the world, but it's overinflated, right? And so I think sometimes what needs to happen, this is tough. This is where tough love is good. This is where you can kind of wake somebody up. I call it a bop on the head. They're just like, whoa. And you just bring them back to reality. And a perfect example of this, I do this with my clients, and I used to do it as a personal trainer. So I'll tell, when I was personal training way back in the day, there's a very specific physical way that I did it. And I also do it mentally. But in the physical way, I have a guy come in and I'm like, okay, what weights do you use for dumbbell bench press? And they're like, 75s, 80s. I'm like, you warm up at 75, 80s? They're like, yeah, I do. So what I do is I then give them 15s. And they're like, what? So already I have them in a confused state. They grab the 15s, and then I teach them how their muscles work. So they just usually throw up weights like it's easy. So I tell them to do 5. They're like, okay, 5. And then I ask sarcastically, is that hard? And they're like, not at all. Then I tell them how to engage the muscles in their chest. And what happens is that your chest muscle pulls, and at the same time, your tricep muscle extends. So when you have the pull of your chest and the extension of your tricep, it's the illusion of a push, but it's actually 2 pulls happening. They're like mind blown. So then they realize that they don't know everything. So then they're gone from a place from thinking they know everything to realizing they don't know everything. Then I have them do the exercise focused correctly. By the 15th rep, they're dead. And I say, it's not the weight, it's the understanding of your body that makes the difference. From that point, they're sold. I gave them the bop. Now they're willing to trust me on different ways of seeing everything. This is the same thing you need to do in businesses. This is the same thing you need to do in the house. Because when a person starts to have this overinflated ego, you have to diffuse it for them to taste reality again. But not in a way where you're like, told you so, but you're like, hey, I just wanted to let you know that there's other ways, and I'm going to give you all the information you need so that you can be able to teach others this as well. Not only do you disempower, you inflate again to a healthy level of empowerment through future understanding, as opposed to them assuming they already know it. So these bops are really, really powerful. And I do the same thing when I do my work with my clients.
Hey, Berkey, that could be a book.
Yeah, right. But it's true, man. It's about waking people up, not in a way to say, respect your elders. It's reality. Now, let me show you some things that can help you along your journey, and hopefully you'll soon surpass me. different process. It's not an ego versus ego. It's an understanding versus ego. That's where
Right.
you gain power.
Yeah, that's a big distinction. So the sixth and last reason that people ignore us is you don't contribute much, right? You show up and I got a big ego, I know it all, right?
Right.
And I'm sure we can all experience and call back to relationships we've been into where it
Right.
feels like you're the only one giving, right? It's a one-sided relationship, but we know that one-sided relationships will in fact die over time. And
Mm-hmm.
being passive and lacking energy to reciprocate drives people away without
Right.
exception. In fact, I would argue that reciprocity is a social contract
Mm.
that really engenders friendly actions and reactions, right?
Right.
People are frequently much nicer to people that are engaged in reacting and sort of give and takes. You know, someone says something and it's like a ping pong match versus you say something and then you try to shoot it down or
Right.
you don't
Right.
even react or respond. So what causes people in your experience to approach relationships from this perspective where they don't really contribute much? Where is it an ego?
Yeah.
Is it
Man.
they just feel they're superior, or is it just that they're not aware?
Yeah. It could be, D, all of the above. But I'll liken it again to physicality. And I think it can. What happens is it always takes two to tango, and I think people often think there's the bad guy and the good guy, or the bad girl, the good guy, whatever it is. There's something called synergistic dominance. When I'm exercising, if I exercise one muscle more than I exercise everything else, it becomes dominant, right? But when it becomes dominant, the antagonist muscle, the opposite muscle, becomes weak. So case in point is if I'm working my chest all the time because I want to get a big chest, pretty soon my chest is going to get tight and it's going to pull my shoulders forward. Right? When it pulls my shoulders forward, my rhomboids become overstretched in the back, right? And what happens is soon I start to sit like this, or I'm sitting at my desk all the time and I do this, this becomes tighter, this becomes looser, this becomes harder to fire, right? So it naturally becomes weaker because of the dominance. The same thing happens if I'm sitting all the time. My hip flexors become tight, which makes my back become tight, but my glutes and my core become weak, which makes me more prone to energy because I'm not kinetically balanced. Same thing in a relationship. If one is over dominant or doing too much, is giving so much, unconsciously, the other one can take so much. And so it creates this synergistic dominance where it puts things into a way where there is not a balance. The ecosystem is unhealthy, right? So the goal is, how do we get back to dominance? Well, that means you have to stretch the tight muscles, and then you have to work out the weak muscles to get it back to balance. The same thing in a relationship. If someone is feeling that they're giving too much and the other person isn't giving enough, there needs to be a conversation, and they both have to acknowledge, hey, maybe I'm enabling you by giving so much, right? So I need to cut back a little bit and you need to step up a little bit. And then you can get back to that balance. But it requires two non-ego participants. That means that the person who's frustrated can't just say, you're weak. This is hard. And this is what makes my work so difficult, is because there has to be the higher road. You have to love yourself so much that it's not about you just being right and the other person being wrong. You have to reflect and you have to question, where am I enabling? Where am I helping? Where am I dancing in this tango? Even if it's 2%, what is within my control? And what people most hate is responsibility, because responsibility equals choice. And the only thing worse than a choice is you being wrong about that choice. That's what people are terrified of. All those three things are the biggest obstacles I have to push through in order for people to become the happiest, most healthiest, interdependent, independent versions of themselves. To be able to take responsibility, even if it's 2%, because everything in them wants to say 98% you, to take responsibility to 2% and make a choice to change it. That's freedom. That's power. But it's very difficult. And it's the only way you can heal relationships. It's the only way that you can grow as a human being, is by taking responsibility. And what happens is, slowly, when you take responsibility, you can call that other person higher. I've taken my part. It's time for you to take yours. And if they still balk, then it's a values issue. And you're not worthy of my relationship. Then I can move out of that relationship to find somebody who's on my frequency. But only until you do your part are you at a space, in my opinion, to where you can be like, our values don't align. I need to move out.
Yeah, that awareness piece is huge, right? And I think
Everything,
we've talked about, hey, love is a choice,
right?
Relationships are a choice, and if you really want to be in one, you got to choose to show up a certain way, become aware, and become knowing, and not be cluttered with a lot of habits, hurts, and hangups, and that continual work that goes on. Same thing in a business where you're what I call hunter killer, right?
Yeah.
You're going for it. I don't care if it's a Fortune 500 or a startup, that mentality where whatever you're given, you're going to do the best you can. You're going to blow it away. It's kind of like that quote, I don't know if it's from Martin Luther King, where, hey, if you're a street sweeper, sweep it so that the angels in heaven can talk
Right.
about it, right?
Right.
Right.
Man,
So it's that mentality.
I love that. There's this is something that I did want to mention. There's a tug of war phenomenon. What they found out is that when people are playing tug of war, a certain majority of people aren't pulling that hard. They're just making it look like they're pulling. This is one of the things I've noticed in businesses too, is that when it looks like everybody's working, there's certain people that aren't really pulling as well. And that kind of ties to the taking it serious. Sometimes people like to hide underneath, right? They like to hide and they don't want to put in that massive amount of effort. And this is why sometimes it's good. This is why the one-on-one conversations are important. And when you talk to your other employees to see what they think about their other employees, and really ask those Socratic questions to really pinpoint if there is somebody that's not really, if there's a consistent like conversation around a single person, it can also help you kind of rid out like, oh, this is where the synergistic dominance is happening. This person's not giving. So, ultimately what I'm saying is that environments create spaces for weeds to grow. And so we always have to understand that controlling the environment, the more you as a leader have understanding over the environment, the more you can pinpoint the issues. Like I said with that thing where I put the table in the middle of the warehouse after it was filled with stuff, environments determine how people act and don't act. And so it's always incumbent upon us as managers, leaders, or people that want to be seen and remembered to always control the environment so that we get the frequencies that we want.
Reminds me of those guys, have you ever seen in the Olympics, those the rowing competition? And I remember I've been in Newport Harbor and I saw these guys in the row class or crew from, I think, a local high school. And of course, they're chiseled, no body fat, and they absolutely fly. And they have a guy that's calling out the strokes, right? And imagine if one side or a couple people on one side aren't pulling the weight. You're going to kind of go off course. You're not going to be as fast. You may go in circles.
Right.
And, I think back to that table analogy is so spot on. I think sometimes we put the equivalent metaphorically of tables in our brain. We have a bunch of tables that are just filled with a lot of junk, a lot of useless stuff, right? And the opportunity to sort of clear off the clutter, become aware, become self-aware, authentic, to be able to call ourselves out. I mean, I think the ultimate goal of evolution is to be able to look at ourselves realistically and call our own bluffs and challenge ourselves that, hey, I could be better. I can do better. It's our own standard we're trying to go towards, as opposed to a standard someone's trying to force on us to get a certain behavior.
That's it. That's what it is.
Yeah. Burke, another masterclass, my friend.
Absolutely. This is always great, Ben. I'm loving it.
Yeah. Enjoy the conversation. Until next time.
Sounds good, buddy.